Thank you for joining us on our YouTube channel as we strive to get a more progressive voice of faith out to a larger audience. Our videos are mostly from the pastor at Community Christian Church in Springfield, Missouri, Dr. Roger Ray. We are always pleased to have feedback from our viewers. You can visit our website at spfccc.org or write to us at reverend.drray@aol.com.
When you create a family through adoption, there are certain moments that just stand out in your mind of when and how you became family. And it isn't the filling out the forms and the visits with the social workers and attorneys and all the legal mess of adoption. It's more those moments when you feel yourselves being connected in mutuality and mutual understanding and connecting across culture. And I remember that 2 a.m. feeding when I held my daughter in my lap when she was just a few months old. And in the moonlight, she would scream like if she didn't eat in a second, the world was going to blow up. And I would have to get up and get the bottle and warm it and get that screaming 15-pound piece of meat out to the sofa. And then she'd take her sweet time. And you'd think anyone that was that hungry would be willing to hold their own bottle. They're not. You have to just get in position and just wait till they're through. But that one night when she lingered over the end of her bottle and we were just looking deeply into each other's eyes, and she reached up and touched my cheek and said her first words, "Mum, Mum." Which was fine with me because I knew exactly what she meant. At the time of her birth, I was very committed to an extremely healthy diet. There was no red meat in our house. There was no fried food. There were no sweets. But one day, Valerie and I were going back to visit my mother and father in Kentucky, and it was a long drive, and I was getting very nostalgic being back in the Kentucky hills. And we stopped at one of those truck stops for a late breakfast. And she ordered oatmeal that she usually got at the time. And I just decided I'm going to go for ethnic food, the kind of food that I grew up eating. And I ordered some salt-cured country ham with biscuits and red-eye gravy and scrambled eggs and grits. And I didn't think she would be very interested in it because salt-cured ham is hard and chewy. But I gave her a bite, and her little Asian almond eyes just suddenly went round. And I ended up with a bowl of oatmeal, and she ate my breakfast. And from that point on, there was this connection where my ethnic food became her ethnic food. And so now, in spite of the fact that this is not health food, we keep a supply of country ham in our home. We don't eat it often, but now and then you need to remember who you are, where you're from. You need to get back to your roots. And so we'll get a little country ham out of the freezer and we'll freeze it up. And the side dishes, you've heard of red-eye gravy. I got to tell you, that's an easy recipe. That's grease with water in it. That's red-eye gravy is just ham gravy, just diluted a little bit. And you pour that over your grits and your scrambled eggs and biscuit. And it'll just take you right back to that old Ray farmstead back in southern Kentucky. Now, some literalists have challenged Valerie that her ethnic food should be Asian, but she always reminds them she is from South Korea, so she is a Southerner, and that is Southern food at heart. But truth be told, men and women, while our country ham meals are good for our souls, they are not good for our hearts. Realistically, no one should ever eat salt-cured ham. But it is a part of the definition of our history, our heritage, who we are. So when people first salt-cured ham, it was the way my ancestors preserved meat. There were no freezers, there were no refrigerators. And I'm just barely old enough to remember when we slaughtered hogs in the early winter, cured the meat through the winter, and by the end of the next summer out in the smokehouse, it had grown a beautiful layer of blue-green mold on the outside of it that would make a lot of people think it had spoiled. But that's just how little you know about country ham, that it may taste spoiled to you, but it's not. It's perfect. Now, we don't need to salt cure meat anymore to preserve it, but we eat it and we get some as a ritual of remembering. It has a symbolic value that is more important to us than its nutritional hazard. You know, most religious rituals are kind of like that. Religious rituals almost all had a very practical beginning. The kosher dietary restrictions of the Hebrew Bible made sense in the culture in which they originated. The rules about agriculture, not mixing different kinds of crops in a field, the kind of apparel that you were to wear, the way you cut your hair, the way you shaved, these helped a group to have identifiable characteristics that preserved them as a people, that kept them from just becoming syncretized and blended in to the rest of the Palestinian cultures that surrounded them. It identified them as a specific tribe. For us, as progressive Christians, it's sometimes hard to tell when we should preserve a tradition and when we should get rid of it. I mean, one of the first things we talked about when we were talking about starting this church is, what will we do when we get together? Once we've decided that we're going to be a church and we all schedule a time that we're going to meet at the same place, what are we going to do when we get there? And we've played with that back and forth. We've taken some stuff out and put some stuff into our Sunday morning rituals. On this Sunday, which is, according to the liturgical calendar, the first Sunday of Lent, the gospel lesson on the first Sunday of Lent is always one of the accounts of the baptism of Jesus. And it's so religious that it kind of makes me nervous. I mean, it's one of those things that I'm not sure that I want to read because I'm not sure that I identify with those symbols. The season of Lent has functioned for many centuries as a time when people who were preparing to be baptized would spend time in personal reflection, in penance, and in prayer to get them ready for this momentous event when they celebrated the sacrament of baptism. But in our church, we've not really put much emphasis on it. We baptize people. We've done infant baptisms by sprinkling here when the family asked for it. We've done an adult baptism by immersion. We had to do it in a swimming pool. We don't have a font here. But we've never implied that anyone was in any way pressured to be baptized. It's not a ritual that we encourage or make necessary. We celebrate it if it is meaningful to that individual, if it's what that individual wants to do. In the days before the Christian era, baptism had become a kind of symbolic bath. It was a part of the rituals involved in converting to Judaism. If you were a Gentile and you wanted to become a Jew, baptism was a part of the ritual, much to be preferred to circumcision. Don't make me go into that. It was a good deal if that's how you got in. John the Baptist appears to have been part of the Essene movement, which took baptism to the extreme of being a bath. And the Essenes, we believe, would observe baptism as frequently as 5 times a day, that they kept washing themselves because they believed that their personal cleanliness, and they wore only white that was bleached and as white as they could get it, because they believed that the more pure and clean they were, that would hasten God's coming when God would kill all the Romans and the Greeks and everybody else and make them in charge of the world. Sort of a Mormon view of life, that they would be the ones that would rule all the planets and all the cities. Baptism was then reinterpreted in the early church to be a ritual participating in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, a kind of sacramental rebirth, a decision that you make that you're going to give up an old way of living and take up a new way of living. Unfortunately, though, and I think that's probably an excellent meaning for baptism, the original one, but the church took it on and laid sort of a magical interpretation on it where you would go to hell if you weren't baptized. And so You would never want to invite one of the early church fathers to a picnic because they would find some way to mess it up. You take something that otherwise would be a meaningful ritual and gesture for you to go through in terms of a personal decision about the life you're going to live, and they turn it into some kind of magical incantation and ritual, and then you just have to wonder whether you want to participate in it or not. And one of our goals here in this church is to get rid of superstition, to get rid of neurotic guilt, to get rid of magic, and to reclaim a kind of spirituality that's deeply invested in the real world, in our real lives. Many things that make perfectly good sense can become ritualized and institutionalized in a way that turns them into a fairly meaningless religious burden. And that's what we don't want in the emerging church. But sometimes we hold on to things just because they are reflections of a tradition that we do love, the tradition through which we came to have a spiritual life. And most of those things are reinterpreted, to be sure, but we don't despise our own roots. We understand where we came from, and we can love that tradition. Baptism, Lent, the whole notion of penitence is oftentimes suspect among progressives. In fact, I would not be surprised to discover that we're one of the only progressive churches in the world that has a prayer of confession as a part of every Sunday service. And granted, these are not coming out of a book of liturgy. I write them every week because what I read in books of liturgical and worship resources of the mainstream church would be inappropriate for us. But I write a prayer of confession every week because I think, and I've even struggled to rename it. I wish we could name it something like a reality orientation prayer, where we acknowledge the way we really are and the world we really live in. But we include that in our liturgy every week. And I've not had, I get letters and requests from people in progressive communities around the country because of our YouTube and iTunes presence. But none of them ever ask for copies of our prayers of confession. It's fairly unique to us. I'm also pretty sure that we're the only progressive church in the world that begins every worship service with a Gregorian chant of a psalm. But for me, that is a part of our tradition, our Christian tradition, that recognizes that the time spent in worship is other than the rest of the week. So we separate our worship time from ordinary time through something that is quite extraordinary. Unless you're me, and I've got a bunch of Gregorian chant on my iPod, but other than me, I bet you don't. So when you come here and you hear a psalm chant, that is an ancient tradition of how worship started, and we do it not because we think we have to or because whatever obligation we might have to the psalm of the day, but because it is a part of our heritage that we have inherited and that we love. Simultaneously, however, we don't want to pass on things that are simply superstitious or neurotic or magical. So when it comes to something like baptism, you're not going to catch me mounting an argument either way. If the symbol is meaningful to you, then I'm all for it. But if not, then I'm not going to expend any breath or energy defending it or insisting on it. However, what it represents, I think that's the real meat of the issue. The presumption that there is something in us that needs to be cleaned up. I think that's probably true. The suggestion that we need to die to an old way of living in order to be resurrected to a new way of living, whether you represent that in baptism or some other way, I think that's the reality. I think that we do turn to a spiritual life for some personal transformation. It seems evident to me that we all come into the world screaming. But we don't come into the world screaming about unemployment or racism or environmental pollution or an unfair distribution of wealth. We come into the world screaming about what we are unhappy about. We scream when we're hungry. We scream when we're tired. We scream when we're bored. We scream when we're wet. We scream when we think mommy and daddy are sleeping a little too much. The problem is that a lot of what passes for human debate about politics is not that different from the screams I used to hear from the nursery at 2 a.m. The sound of a baby wanting a bottle and the sound of a rich person wanting another tax cut is cut from the same piece of primordial cloth. It's basically the same kind of screaming and whining. To embrace a spiritual life is in many ways to do what the Buddha called giving up the illusion of the separation of ourselves from others. The Buddha taught that part of your spiritual awakening is to regain a sense of connectedness to every other living thing. The spiritual life is unnatural because it asks you to stop thinking about your own appetites. It asks you to stop worrying so much about when you are hungry or bored or tired or wet. And it asks you to grow in compassion, to be able to feel the kind of wetness that a homeless person feels when it has rained and the tent that they're living in or the lean-to they're living in where all of their sleeping bags and blankets get wet. Or on Thursdays and Fridays. You know, we've been doing this Bill's Place thing for a couple of years now, but we take a hot meal and then we started this tradition of making sandwiches that we call the takeaway sandwiches. And our idea when we started that was, okay, we're going to feed them a hot meal early in the morning and then give them something to eat later in the evening. Or even we have suggested to them this glorious ideal that we know there's a lot of homeless people that are afraid to come into the shelters. They've got warrants for their arrest or they've got issues that keep them away. So we give them a sandwich and tell them, share that with someone that you encounter that hasn't eaten. But I'm going to say that 9 out of 10 of the sandwiches that we pass out are consumed before our taillights have disappeared on Commercial Street. Because for the genuinely poor, there is no tonight. There is no later. They have learned to live in the moment, a moment when they have no idea what's going to happen to them by this afternoon. And so we feed them a big hot meal, and we have to feed them at 10:15 in the morning, and then they'll take a sandwich or 2 or 3, and as soon as we're packing up, as soon as they've let that meal that they've had settle, they're stuffing that sandwich in their face. That's the kind of desperation. That's the kind of hunger that we ought to be screaming about. That's the kind of thing that ought to make us shout. Because I am baptized. And because I'm baptized, I no longer want to waste my breath screaming about how I'd like to live in a nicer house or drive a newer car or wear nicer clothes. I want to scream about children living in cars. I want to scream about the unemployed. I want to scream about the uninsured being denied the basic necessities of life. I want to scream about payday loan shops making a profit off of the desperation of the poor and the addicted. I want to scream about men in state legislatures wanting to stick some electronic device into the bodies of women who've come asking for an abortion just to humiliate them and just to show them that they've got power over them. I want to scream about using our military might to keep gasoline cheap while we sit back and watch tens of thousands die in a tortured Syrian genocide. I don't know that I need to baptize everyone in the world, but I do know that the world is full of sin. The world is full of darkness. And the concept of repentance is not an antique concept. It does not need to be disposed of by the progressive church. During the dark days of apartheid in South Africa, Alan Bosak said to a white congregation, "On Judgment Day, we will stand before the Lord, and the Lord will ask us, 'Where are your scars?' And we will answer, 'Lord, we have none.' And the Lord will say, 'Did you find nothing worth fighting for?'" Men and women, if you're not shouting about the evil in our age, then you're not paying attention, because we got a lot to fight for. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.